What if I told you the cozy holiday desserts your grandparents swore were family recipes were actually invented by corporate marketers and protected by a woman who never existed? Betty Crocker wasn't a grandma, she was a brand. For decades she taught America to love Jell-O molds, canned fruitcakes, and glossy gelatin salads. But a lost family recipe, whispered about, then quietly erased from cookbooks, claims to expose the marketing machine that shaped our holiday table. Stick with me till the end. The secret buried in that recipe will make you question every festive bite your family passes down. The scent of cinnamon and sugar filled the old farmhouse every Christmas Eve. A white cake, light as air, sat at the center of the Creelian family's table, the snowdrift cake. Grandma Evelyn used to whisper, "This isn't just dessert, it's a promise." But what no one knew was that this promise wasn't entirely hers to keep. The story begins in 1945, post-war Minnesota. Food rationing was easing, and the nation was hungry for comfort. Housewives turned to Betty Crocker, the warm voice on radio and glossy cookbooks, promising hope through frosting. Yet Betty Crocker wasn't real, she was a marketing invention. A carefully built illusion to sell flour, sugar, and the dream of domestic perfection. That year, a salesman from General Mills visited the Creelians, offering recipe testing kits. Evelyn handed him a family recipe, a snow-white cake made with evaporated milk and almond glaze, one she claimed had been in her family since the 1880s. Weeks later, the salesman disappeared. So did her only written copy. In 1948, Betty Crocker's Holiday Edition cookbook featured a new recipe, the snowdrift frosting cake. Word for word, it matched Evelyn's. Evelyn never spoke about it again, until the winter of 1961. Her granddaughter found an unsigned letter tucked inside a flour tin. It read, "We regret the misunderstanding. Your recipe lives on. Do not pursue." There was no return address, only a red stamp marked Minneapolis. Decades later, a historian uncovering vintage cookbooks found that same phrase, "We regret the misunderstanding," printed faintly in a margin note of the 1948 Betty Crocker manuscript archives. No one ever claimed responsibility. Today, the Creelian family's original recipe is missing from every local record. But the library's logbook still shows an unreturned file titled Snowdrift, Confidential, 1947. Who sent that letter? Why was Evelyn warned not to pursue? And what did the words, "Your recipe lives on," truly mean? Who sent that letter? Why was Evelyn warned not to pursue? And what did the words, "Your recipe lives on," truly mean? Because if you look closely at the old Betty Crocker Christmas illustrations, a shadowed woman sometimes appears in the kitchen corner, not the famous red-haired hostess, but a faint figure in a floral apron, holding a white cake. Some say that's Evelyn, still waiting for her credit. In 1952, a new dessert started making quiet waves across suburban America: cherry coconut bars. Glossy red cherries, snowy coconut flakes, and that perfect shortbread crust. They looked innocent enough, the kind of treat you'd find at a Sunday church bake sale. But behind this cheerful recipe lay a story of vanishing pages, forbidden ingredients, and a baker who disappeared from every record after 1953. Her name was Lydia Price, a home economics teacher from Des Moines, Iowa. She mailed her cherry coconut bar recipe to Betty Crocker's Homemaker of Tomorrow contest, hoping it'd win her a small prize. Instead, she received a polite rejection letter, and then silence. Months later, Lydia's niece opened the brand new Betty Crocker Picture Cookbook, 1953 edition, and there it was. Cherry Coconut Dream Bars. Word for word, ingredient for ingredient. Even the serving suggestion, "Best served after midnight when the house is quiet," was identical to Lydia's original note. When the family tried to contact the publisher, they got no response. But one local librarian remembered Lydia. She said Lydia had come in, shaken, carrying the cookbook, whispering, "They printed my handwriting." Then, in December 1953, Lydia vanished. She left behind her mixing bowls, her church apron, and a single note pinned to the wall. The bars were not mine anymore. Her house stood empty for nearly a decade. Neighbors said the kitchen light would flicker at night, and the smell of warm cherries would drift through the windows every December. When the home was sold in 1965, the new owners found a sealed metal tin under the floorboards. Inside, a recipe card. Cherry coconut bars. In the corner, written faintly in red ink. Not Betty's. Not mine. Don't bake after dark. No one knows what that meant. But even today, the original 1953 edition of Betty Crocker's cookbook has one page, page 214, that sometimes appears blank in scanned copies, even in digital archives. Coincidence? Printing error? Or something intentionally removed? Whatever the truth, one thing's certain: somewhere in a small Iowa town, on cold December nights, that faint scent of cherry and coconut still lingers. And maybe Lydia never really left her kitchen after all. By the late 1950s, ribbon nut cake had become a staple of small-town church suppers across America, a striped, layered loaf of pecans, dates, and candied cherries. Every church cookbook had its version, but one, from a quiet town in Missouri, carried a chilling footnote. Do not alter. Original copy missing since 1957. The recipe's author was Margaret Holloway, a church secretary known for her meticulous baking and even more meticulous bookkeeping. She first unveiled her ribbon nut cake at the annual St. Bridget's Christmas feast, a golden, three-layered masterpiece said to taste like heaven after hardship. But within a year, Margaret vanished, and so did her handwritten recipe book. When the church later built a new basement hall, workers found something odd beneath the floorboards: a rusted tin box sealed with wax. Inside were brittle pages of old church ledgers, donation slips, and a folded recipe card, wrapped in wax paper. The ink had bled, but one line was still visible. Ribbon nut cake, property of General Mills. That note didn't make sense. Margaret had no ties to any company. Yet when the Betty Crocker Holiday Baking Edition of 1958 hit shelves, one of its new features was a ribbon nut loaf, credited vaguely to Midwestern Test Kitchens. A retired church member later swore he saw a woman in a red cardigan, Margaret's usual attire, sitting in the church basement weeks after her disappearance. He said she was mixing something in an invisible bowl, whispering, "They can take the recipe, but not the blessing." The town kept quiet. The local paper never printed her story. But in 1994, when the church archives were digitized, the scan of that ledger file caused an odd glitch. The screen displayed a flickering red ribbon across the image, before crashing entirely. IT technicians called it corrupted data. To this day, no one knows who sent Margaret's recipe to General Mills. Her family never received a dime, and the handwritten card from the tin box now rests, sealed in glass, at the town's small museum, uncredited, unsigned, and eerily fragrant, as though the scent of candied fruit still lingers beneath the glass. Some say if you stand in the old church kitchen at midnight, you can still hear her spoon tapping 3 times, the sound that once meant another slice was ready. Every American family had a frozen dessert story in the 1940s. The icebox was new, glamorous, a symbol of modern living. But for one woman in Maine, her frozen creation became the center of a secret so cold, it stayed buried for nearly 70 years. Her name was Helen Morell, a war widow who made ends meet by selling homemade cranberry desserts from her small farmhouse kitchen. Locals adored her cranberry icebox dessert, layers of tart cranberry jelly, whipped cream, and graham crackers chilled overnight until they formed a perfect slice of pink nostalgia. But one winter in 1944, something strange happened. Helen sent her recipe to a national wartime creativity contest, sponsored by Betty Crocker's Test Kitchens. Weeks later, her radio went silent, the program that promised to announce the winners abruptly canceled. And by spring, Helen had disappeared. When her home was sold decades later, a contractor tearing out an old icebox made a bizarre discovery. Hidden inside the insulation panel was a leather-bound diary, frozen stiff and sealed in frost. The first page was smeared, but the words were clear enough to chill anyone. They came for the recipe, not for me. Inside were pages describing how 2 men from the company had visited her home, asking for her cranberry formula for national distribution. She refused, calling it her last memory of Walter, her husband who'd died overseas. The diary ended mid-sentence. If I don't answer tomorrow, check the freezer. After that page, blank sheets. Nothing else. In 1945, Betty Crocker's Holiday Helper Cookbook introduced a new recipe: Cranberry Icebox Wonder. It was identical to Helen's, except one crucial detail: it added a line: perfect for lonely hearts and brave wives. Locals in the town of Camden, Maine still talk about her. Some claim on freezing December nights, you can hear a soft humming from the old Morel property, the tune of a 1940s Betty Crocker jingle. And the strangest thing? The original cookbook photo shows something impossible: a faint reflection of a woman's face in the freezer door, though no one was standing there during the shoot. They say the cold never really left that kitchen. Maybe because the story never thawed. In 1956, deep in the humid stillness of Key Largo, Florida, a pie was served at a funeral that no one forgot. It was called Pineapple Dream Pie, golden, sweet, and airy, with a whipped filling that shimmered like sunlight on water. The guests swore it tasted too good for sorrow. But that pie would soon become the center of one of the eeriest culinary mysteries in American cookbook history. The recipe belonged to Mrs. Edna Ray Collier, a quiet homemaker known for her hospitality and handwritten cookbooks bound with twine. When her husband passed, she made that pineapple dream pie for his memorial. Days later, a traveling culinary scout from the Betty Crocker kitchens, a woman named Miss Hampton, arrived at her home, offering condolences and interest in the recipe. Edna refused to share it, calling it his final gift. A month later, she fell ill and was taken to a hospital in Miami. By the time her sister came to clear her things, the recipe notebook was gone. Strangely, her kitchen smelled of pineapple and melted butter, though the stove was cold. The following spring, Betty Crocker's 1957 summer recipes leaflet featured a new delight: Pineapple Dream Pie. Identical ingredients. Identical name. No credit. The Collier family wrote letters, even contacted the press, but no one responded. Then, one July evening, Edna's sister received a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph, the printed recipe page, circled in red, and a single typed sentence: "Some dreams aren't meant to be kept." Within a year, strange stories began to swirl around the Collier home. The pie wouldn't set right no matter who baked it. Meringue curdled, crusts burned. And more than once, family members claimed to hear a faint whisper when the oven timer rang, a woman's voice saying, "That's not how he liked it." By 1960, the Collier family stopped making the pie altogether. But curiously, every time a new Betty Crocker cookbook released a variation of that dessert, a newspaper obituary appeared in Key Largo the same week, always someone distantly related to Edna. Coincidence? Maybe. But locals still say if you bake pineapple dream pie at midnight, the whipped cream turns gray, and the air smells faintly of salt and grief. In the autumn of 1943, when sugar was rationed and flour came in paper sacks stamped with red ink, a young war bride in Pennsylvania baked her first spiced applesauce cake. Her name was Clara Hensley, and she made it from scraps, leftover apples, a spoon of lard, and a memory her mother had whispered before passing: "Cinnamon hides sorrow." But Clara's version of the cake would do far more than comfort soldiers. It would ignite one of the strangest wartime mysteries ever buried in an American kitchen. Her husband, William, was stationed overseas. Each week she sent him a care package, socks, letters, and that cake, wrapped in wax paper. But in early 1944, one of her cakes was returned, unopened, with the note: "Recipe received. Thank you for your service." Weeks later, her home caught fire. Neighbors swore they saw flames burst from the oven, as if it had exploded from the inside. When firefighters arrived, the kitchen was gone, But one thing survived: her recipe card. Untouched, unburned, resting atop the ashes. Across the back, written in unfamiliar handwriting, were the words: Approved, GM 1944 test sample number 37. Clara never baked again. She moved in with her sister, silent, withdrawn. Yet in 1945, when America celebrated victory, Betty Crocker released the Wartime Collection Cookbook, featuring a brand new recipe: spiced applesauce cake. Identical ingredients. Identical baking time. Even the same phrase Clara had used. Cinnamon hides sorrow. The oddest detail? Next to the printed recipe, there was a small footnote. Adapted from a patriotic submission. No name. No credit. Years later, Clara's grandson uncovered a government file marked Restricted Recipes, 1943-45. Inside were lists of wartime kitchen experiments, using home cooks' recipes to test replacement ingredients. Project code: Operation Hearth. In one corner, a typed line read: Test sample number 37, spiced applesauce cake. Source: Hensley, C. Domestic Civilian, Pennsylvania. Outcome: successful. Was Clara's recipe used as a Ration-era experiment? Or was she unknowingly part of a wartime project that turned homemakers into unpaid test subjects? Clara passed in 1971, never speaking of the fire again. But every year, when her family bakes that cake, the cinnamon smoke curls in a peculiar way, spelling something faint, almost legible. A single word: approved. In the shiny optimism of 1955 America, Peppermint Angel food cake was the picture of post-war perfection: pink swirls, fluffy whites, crushed candy canes sprinkled like confetti. Housewives made it to celebrate peace, prosperity, and something called the modern woman's kitchen. One of those women was Dorothy Reeves, a young mother from Cleveland who had just won a local baking contest. Her prize? A tour of the Betty Crocker test kitchens in Minneapolis, where she was asked to demonstrate her signature Peppermint Angel food cake for radio broadcast. That recording never aired. Dorothy returned home weeks later, distant and silent. She told her sister she heard a woman's voice speaking through the stand mixer during the recording, repeating her words a split second before she said them. The producers told her it was feedback. But Dorothy swore it wasn't. Months later, Betty Crocker's radio program introduced a new dessert called Peppermint Angel Cake, complete with Dorothy's unique frosting swirl, red stripes folded in a figure-8 motion. She received no credit. When she complained, she was told the broadcast tape had been lost in transit. But it hadn't been lost. In 1972, a janitor cleaning the basement of WCCO radio found a dusty metal reel labeled Reeves, Segment 9. The tape was warped but playable. When restored by a local archivist, it contained something unsettling: static, faint kitchen sounds, and then a woman's voice saying, "This is Dorothy Reeves, Peppermint Angel Food Cake, Recipe 1. Then another voice, identical to hers, overlapping softly, whispering, "Not yours anymore, Dorothy." No record of the duplicate voice was ever found. Sound engineers couldn't explain it. And when the archivist who restored the tape tried to donate it to General Mills, the company declined, stating, "We have no record of that session." Dorothy passed away in 1983. In her will, she left a note inside her old mixer box. It read, "If you hear the echo, stop stirring." Her daughter, now in her 70s, says she's still never made peppermint desserts. The smell, she claims, brings the echo back. And when she plugged in her mother's old mixer one last time, just to see if it worked, the motor wouldn't start. But for one brief second, the bowl began to spin on its own. It was 1942, a year of rations, letters, and long waits. Sugar was precious, butter even more so. Yet, somewhere between the blackouts and the air raid drills, butterscotch refrigerator cookies became a quiet act of love. They were simple: brown sugar, butter, flour, eggs, mixed, rolled, chilled overnight, and sliced thin before baking. Housewives clipped the recipe from the Betty Crocker Victory Cookbook and mailed it to their husbands overseas. One bite, they said, tasted like home. But one version of this recipe wasn't in any cookbook. A woman named Clara Bell, from Wichita, wrote to General Mills in 1944 claiming Betty Crocker had stolen her recipe, word for word, from a personal letter she'd sent to her husband, a sergeant stationed in France. She said the letter had disappeared in the mail, and months later, her exact words appeared in a Betty Crocker recipe column. Even her phrase, "Keep them cool like a soldier's calm heart," was there. General Mills never replied. When Clara pressed harder, she received an unsigned note in the mail. "Some recipes aren't ours to own, they choose their name." Disturbed but determined, Clara baked the cookies again, one final time, before burning her handwritten copy. She stopped baking entirely after that. Her husband never returned from the war. Years later, in 1959, Clara's niece bought an old recipe box at an estate sale in Minneapolis. Inside, she found several typed cards, all labeled "Test Kitchen Drafts." Among them was a faded sheet with a typed header. Recipe #117B, Butterscotch Refrigerator, source undisclosed. Below it, in pencil, someone had written, "From letter, keep quiet." Even stranger, the handwriting matched Clara's. Some say Betty Crocker wasn't just a marketing creation, she was a vessel, a collective voice that absorbed the words, emotions, and memories of American women during wartime. Recipes became whispers, whispers became radio scripts, and soon, no one knew where the real voices had gone. Clara died in 1966. When her house was sold, neighbors claimed they often smelled burned sugar and butter, faint, sweet, lingering in the air long after the ovens had gone cold. Some say that smell still drifts through the old Betty Crocker test kitchen on quiet nights. A reminder that maybe, not every recipe was written by hand. In small-town Ohio during World War II, there was a widow named Eleanor Finch, who baked every Sunday as if her husband were still alive. Her kitchen smelled of ginger, cinnamon, and dark molasses, a scent that drifted down her quiet street like a memory refusing to fade. Eleanor's favorite recipe came from a 1941 Betty Crocker pamphlet, Molasses Crinkles. Simple, chewy cookies dusted with sugar, soft in the middle, crisp at the edge. But Eleanor swore hers were different. She said they spoke to her. Whenever someone close to her was in danger or about to arrive, the cookies would rise higher than usual, puffing up like little warning signals in the oven. The first time it happened, her brother, a pilot, had just survived a crash landing. The second time, a neighbor's son came home from overseas unexpectedly that same evening. By 1944, word spread through town that Eleanor's kitchen could smell the future. Women began visiting her house, asking her to bake a batch when they hadn't heard from their loved ones in months. If the cookies stayed flat, their hearts sank. But if they rose, hope returned. Then came Christmas Eve, 1945. The war was over, the streets were alive again, but Eleanor stayed home, baking alone. That night, the cookies didn't just rise, they cracked open. Perfect little fissures, steam curling from their tops like breath in winter air. She said it meant someone was at the door. When she opened it, a man stood there in uniform, covered in snow, his face barely recognizable. But she knew the eyes. Her husband, long presumed dead. He never explained how he'd survived, only said that a letter had called him home. When Eleanor asked who sent it, he said, "It was signed by someone named Betty Crocker." The next morning, the cookies wouldn't bake anymore. The dough stayed cold, lifeless. Eleanor never touched that recipe again. Her neighbors kept copies of her handwritten version, but none could ever get the cookies to rise. And even today, collectors claim that in old cookbooks, if you look at the Molasses Crinkles page under dim light, you can see faint writing across the margin. They rise only when someone returns. It was the coldest Christmas New York had seen in decades. December 26, 1947, the blizzard that buried the city under 2 feet of snow. Roads were frozen, trains silent, and the city that never slept was finally still. But in a quiet brownstone on 83rd Street, a cake appeared on a table that no one had baked. The Christmas snow cake was a recipe rumored to exist only in Betty Crocker's 1940s holiday drafts, a coconut vanilla chiffon cake layered with whipped frosting so white it shimmered like ice. Housewives claimed it was too delicate to make. One wrong move, and the whole thing collapsed. Yet that morning, the Hendricks family woke to the scent of vanilla and sugar drifting through their home. Their youngest, Annie, said she'd heard someone humming in the kitchen. A woman's voice, soft and calm, singing Silent Night. When her mother went to check, there was no one there. Only the cake. They tried to explain it away. Maybe a neighbor? A prank? But when Mrs. Hendricks cut the first slice, she found something wedged inside the middle layer, a piece of parchment, folded 3 times, browned with age. On it, in perfect typewritten font, were the words, "Snow keeps the past quiet. Serve before it melts." The family laughed nervously and ate it anyway. That night, Mr. Hendricks received a telegram. His brother's ship, long missing at sea since 1943, had finally been found. His body, preserved in ice near Greenland. The telegram was dated 5 days before the blizzard. The cake stayed perfectly white for weeks, never spoiling, until Mrs. Hendricks threw it out on New Year's Eve. But neighbors swore that when she lifted the lid of the trash can, the air smelled like vanilla and fresh snow, the same scent they noticed every Christmas for the rest of her life. In 1971, a young collector found an unpublished Betty Crocker recipe card in a Minneapolis archive labeled, "Snow Cake, do not print, 1947. The final note read, "Created after a storm. Inspired by no living baker." So maybe the snow cake wasn't baked by human hands at all, but by something colder, older, and sweet enough to be remembered only once a year. It was 1953, the golden age of American radio. Kitchens buzzed with static and laughter as housewives tuned in to the Betty Crocker Show, where cheerful voices promised warmth, order, and sweetness in a post-war world. But one night, something strange happened, and it all started with a recipe called orange glazed loaf. Listeners remembered it clearly. The host's tone changed halfway through the broadcast. Gone was the upbeat charm, replaced by a slow, measured voice that sounded almost mechanical. She described the ingredients in uncanny detail. 3 cups of flour, 1 teaspoon of memory, and the juice of 1 forgotten afternoon. The audience laughed at first, thinking it was a joke. Then the broadcast cut to static, 37 seconds of complete silence. When the show returned, the host simply said, "If you've written it down, do not bake it at night." That warning never aired again. Yet, across America, dozens of homemakers had already scribbled the recipe from memory. One was Martha Greer, a mother of 3 in Des Moines. She baked it the next evening, just before midnight, curious about the mystery. The loaf rose beautifully, golden, glistening under the kitchen light. But as soon as she drizzled the glaze, the radio in her living room turned on by itself. It played the same voice. Only this time, it said her name. "Martha, you shouldn't have baked it." Her husband rushed in, thinking it was a prank. But the station logs from that night showed no broadcast. The frequency was off-air. In the morning, the loaf was gone. Only the tin remained, sticky with orange syrup, warm to the touch. Weeks later, letters began flooding General Mills. Women across the country described identical experiences. A voice on the radio, the same eerie silence, the same missing loaf. Betty Crocker's show never acknowledged it. Orange glazed loaf, script pulled after transmission anomaly. Tape damaged beyond repair. No one knows what was on that tape. But vintage collectors say, if you play an old 1950s Betty Crocker reel in reverse, just before the static, you'll hear her whisper, "The oven remembers." In November 1955, the Betty Crocker Picture Cookbook released a limited edition Thanksgiving insert, a few extra pages tucked between the pie section and frostings. But here's the thing, only about 200 copies ever had it. The rest? Completely blank where the recipe should have been. Those lucky few found something unusual, a pie so beautiful, it shimmered like gold in the candlelight. It was called Golden Pumpkin Chiffon Pie, and the directions seemed ordinary at first: pumpkin puree, sugar, gelatin, egg whites, and whipped cream. But then came one strange line. Fold gently until the mixture hums. Most readers assumed it was a typo. But one woman, Helen Marlowe of Cedar Rapids, decided to try it anyway. Helen lived alone. Her husband had been missing since the Korean War. On Thanksgiving Eve, she mixed the filling by hand, whisking slowly under the glow of a single kitchen bulb. At first, nothing happened. Then she swore she heard something faint, a low hum, like a distant lullaby. The pie seemed to tremble. When she poured it into the crust, the top gleamed faintly, not like sugar, but metal. She refrigerated it overnight. By morning, the pie had turned a brilliant amber gold. And in its center, a single word had appeared, as if written by steam. Home. That afternoon, there was a knock at her door. It was her husband. Alive. He claimed he'd been rescued months ago but couldn't find his way home, until the previous night, when he saw a glowing pie on the windowsill. In a dream. They ate it together that Thanksgiving. But when Helen went to make it again the following year, the page was gone. Torn clean from the book. Archivists at General Mills deny the recipe ever existed, though a typewritten draft was found in the 1956 test kitchen files marked "Do not reproduce, emits tone at 512 Hz. To this day, collectors call it the singing pie. Some swear that if you mix pumpkin and sugar at midnight the night before Thanksgiving, you can still hear it hum, a sound somewhere between a lullaby and a heartbeat, calling someone home. And that was just a taste of Betty Crocker's forgotten Christmas kitchen. Behind every sweet slice and frosted memory lies something deeper, whispers of families, love letters, lost soldiers, and maybe something that never wanted to be forgotten at all. These recipes weren't just desserts. They were messages, memories, and sometimes mysteries. From the snow cake that baked itself after the storm, to the orange loaf that silenced the radio, every dish seemed to hold a heartbeat, one that still echoes through old cookbooks and kitchens across America. But now, I want to hear your story. Thought balloon, which one of these lost holiday desserts did you recognize, or maybe even try once? If you could bring one of them back to your own family table this Christmas, which would it be? And tell me, from where in the world are you watching this tonight, and how old were you when you last tasted something that reminded you of home? Drop your memories in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to uncover the next mystery recipe from America's forgotten kitchens, you already know what to do. Subscribe, and let's keep our country's sweetest secrets alive. United States.